Hello, let's talk about August Wilson's play King Hedley II. It's really his darkest play, and in some ways his most problematic. There's a small number of characters. It's kind of talky, but if you take a look at that ending when you get there. I'd be happy to hear what you think about that ending. I want to draw your attention to the role of Stool Pigeon. He begins the play by interacting with an offstage cat, and the stage directions even mention when the cat meows. Now, if you've read Wilson's play Gem of the Ocean, the character Aunt Esther is a main character in that story. So if you've read that play, then if you were, because Gem of the Ocean is set in 1904, and it's chronologically the first play in the 20th century cycle of 10 plays. August Wilson wrote a play for every decade in the 20th century. So now he didn't write them in chronological order, but if you start with that first play and you introduce yourself to Aunt Esther, then if you get to King Hedley II, Stool Pigeon's reference to Aunt Esther is a reference to a character you already know. We kind of carry Aunt Esther with us throughout the whole our whole experience with August Wilson. But I want to mention that at the time August Wilson wrote King Hedley II, for the first audiences to see King Hedley II, he hadn't yet written Gem of the Ocean. So those first audiences would never have, they wouldn't be able to compare this offstage character that people talk about with their own experiences of reading or maybe seeing Aunt Esther in the flesh in Gem of the Ocean. So the characters in this play talk about Aunt Esther, but really they're talking about mostly her absence. And in this play, it's Stool Pigeon who plays the role of the spiritual leader. Now, we learn in the dialogue that Stool Pigeon used to be a musician, and he got the nickname Stool Pigeon because he turned someone into the police. But his real name, it's spelled Canewell. I've heard it pronounced Canewell, and I've heard it pronounced Canoel. Honestly, I haven't seen a production that mentions this character, so I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. But it is the character who was one of the band members in Wilson's play Seven Guitars. We've seen Canoel before, who here we know by the name Stool Pigeon. Likewise, in Wilson's play Seven Guitars, we also met Ruby as a young woman. Ruby shows up pregnant at her Aunt Louisa's house, and she's worried that one of her lovers is going to kill another lover. And we see Ruby 40 years later as a retired blues singer in this play, King Hedley II. Now, in that earlier play, Seven Guitars, the character Hedley I wants to leave his mark on the world and wants a child. He wants other things too, but we don't actually need to know everything that happened in Seven Guitars in order to understand what happens in King Hedley II. So I'm not going to summarize the plot of that play. But among the issues that this play, King Hedley II, covers is children growing up without regular contact with their parents, and the code of honor among men who, because of institutional racism, is denying these black men advancement in respectable jobs. And so these men are making a living in various, illegal ways on the street, reselling stolen property and tricking each other into overpaying each other on jewelry, using guns to establish their social pecking order on the street. And we see characters pursuing companionship so that they can feel like a man, feel like a woman with each other. And we also have characters talking about settling old scores. And this is not just happening in the young generation. We see these issues happening at two different generations. So the play describes King as having a big scar on his face. And it's the result of an attack by a rival. And King's retaliation against that rival put him in jail. And although the scar is only mentioned a couple times in dialogue, you have to recognize that on stage, that scar would be present the entire time, and it would remind us constantly of this burden that King bears, that he's a marked man. He feels this cultural pressure as a man who must present a strong front in order to have any credibility in his society, and he's pressured to pay his rival back for the harm that he was caused by paying back, and the blood for blood, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of mentality. Now, apart from this sort of manly pursuit of honor, King is telling himself that he's only committing these various crimes just in order to raise enough money to go into a legitimate business. He wants to start as a video rental store. And by the way, at the time this play was written in the 90s, video rental stores were still economically viable, but they were kind of stagnating. I think Wilson probably saw the writing on the wall. This play set during the 80s. Now, I was a teenager and a college student during the 80s. Video stores were everywhere. It might have seemed like a perfectly reasonable business choice to think that if you open a video store, you'll do well. But today, we can see that King's hopes for the future are misguided. And I think probably when Wilson was writing this play in the 90s, he chose, he didn't choose going into computers or something like that. Video rental stores are on the way out. Okay, so I want to shift now to talking about the form of drama in general, and how it relates to this particular play. Now, the classical Greek plays, 2,500 years ago, were actually written to be performed at a religious festival honoring the god Dionysus. And by the way, my name, Dennis, is in honor of Dionysus, so I have a, fondness for the god Dionysus. To perform in a play was to take part in a religious ritual, and attending a play was an occasion for you to encounter the divine. You learned messages about how humans relate to the gods. Now, in classical theater, a tragedy, as opposed to a comedy, a tragedy is traditionally a story that follows an important person, a notable person, a person specially marked by the gods, by some destiny, moving from a position of power and influence and respect to a position of weakness. Meanwhile, as the protagonist is being humbled, the protagonist also approaches self-understanding. So those are the kind of actions that are happening in a classical Greek tragedy. Now, the word tragedy itself derives from the Greek word for goat song, and there are references to a goat sacrifice in this particular play. The goat was an animal that would take on the term scapegoat. The animal would take on the sins and the faults and the guilt and the suffering of the community. And then when the priest sacrificed that animal, the community could start healing. That would start the process of healing the community. Now, repeatedly in this play, King asks other characters whether they see a halo over his head, and the other characters talk about it as well. And in a later scene, King reports unexpectedly coming across the grave of a rival that he had killed. And in that encounter with mortality, he's surprised he's stunned by the idea of thinking of this other man, his rival, as somebody's son, as somebody's father. So King has these moments when Wilson really gives him an interior life that elevates him, that makes him a very complex character, as flawed as he is. In the classical Greek tragedies, one of the most notable characteristics was the function of the chorus. Just like in a modern musical where you have the ensemble of townspeople who, start off the show by singing about how weird Belle is, or how happy they are to be on Moana's island. The function of the chorus in the Greek play is to guide the audience's emotional reactions to what the protagonist is doing, and guiding their intellectual responses as well. Now, we hear offstage stories about the influence of Aunt Esther on the community and how other various named members of the community are acting and reacting to the events that we see staged. And some of these characters never make it on stage, but the characters on stage do talk about them. In addition, on stage, there's some references to blues music. In this play, blues music is not perhaps as front and center as it is in some of Wilson's other works, but the blues itself structurally has a call and response sort of situation where you have a song leader and the crowd responding to the song leader. And that structure very much echoes in the structure of a Greek play. You would usually have a chorus leader who says something, and then the chorus as a whole in union responds. So I'm mentioning these details about Greek drama in case in case you're not familiar with them. But as I mentioned before, while Aunt Esther is present in this play through her absence, stool pigeons, frequent and extended use of quotations from the Bible kind of set him up as the chorus leader. But Wilson also gives stool pigeon a couple of other functions. I mean, he's presenting the language of the Bible in this sort of authoritarian, confident way that a preacher would talk about traditional Christianity. But stool pigeon is also following his own rituals that have nothing to do with Christianity. He's using the words of the Bible to explain what he's doing. And I don't know, your reaction to his scenes may be a little bit different, but I practically snorted my tea through my nose a couple times reading the way Wilson has him dropping F-bombs and contrasting the biblical language and the praise of God with the F-bombs left and right. And Wilson went to Catholic school as a kid, and he knows his Bible well. And I think he wants to, shock us and make us clutch at our pearls a little bit, while at the same time celebrating how, God is bigger than any one of us, and our paltry ways of trying to know and control and worship and understand the divine are limiting in Wilson's view. And like Wilson himself, Wilson had a white father and a black mother. Like Wilson, this play has a mixed heritage. And I think if our understanding of Wilson's artistic achievement benefits from exploring how blues music and how, traditional African spirituality, elements of African tribal religions inform Wilson's work, I think we can also benefit from looking at how the origins of European drama also inform Wilson's work. So as I start to wrap it up, what are some passages that you think are worth a closer look when it comes to exploring this mixed literary heritage? How does Wilson build on and remix and overextend and recombine and reject and challenge and reinvent these familiar heroic tropes that you might find listed in a book like Foster's How to Read Literature Like a Professor? The heroic tropes and biblical references and the hero's journey. How does Hedley's journey suggest a mystery story? And how does how does this play respond to street gangster action movies? If you're familiar with tragic classic heroes like Hamlet or Oedipus from Oedipus Tyrannus, Sophocles' Greek play, how does Hedley's character compare? Now, I don't mean to suggest that the play King Hedley II is worth studying only because it follows the format of a Greek tragedy or the ways that it engages with the Greek tragedy, or that other Wilson plays that don't, hew so closely to the format of a Greek tragedy are somehow inferior. But I am trying to point out that one way to approach a work of literature is to analyze its form. And one way we can do that is by looking at how Wilson's work engages with other forms, in this case, the classical Greek tragedy, but also blues music and also traditional Christian prophetic teachings. How these are all ways of understanding the artistic achievements of August Wilson. And anyway, so from the English department at Seton Hill University, I'm Dennis Jers, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about August Wilson's play, King Hedley II.